to be working again with the Munroe Center for Social Inquiry and Professor Siegel to sponsor this event. Richard Kahlenberg's lecture is also part of our Institute's spring series on the future of higher education, gender, geography, and humanities. We have two additional joint events that I'd like to tell you about. The next is a screening of the documentary Race to Nowhere on Tuesday, March 29th at 5:30 p.m. in Garrison Theater on Scripps campus. The screening is going to be followed by a panel discussion with the film's director, Vicki Abeles, and Professors Gilda Ocha from Pomona and Yu Young Kang from Scripps. The panel is moderated by Professor Siegel. Our last joint event is going to be a lecture by Jonathan Kozel, also co-sponsored by the Alexa Fullerton Hampton Speaker Series, Voice and Vision at Scripps College. That talk titled A New War on Poverty, on Equality and Opportunity in America will be at 7 p.m. in Garrison Theater on Tuesday, April 26th. So look out for those two events. I also want to mention that the Scripps Humanities Institute's lecture series continues this Thursday with our first of 3 luncheon panels discussions titled Hands-on Learning, Music, Digital Humanities, and Community Engagement. That panel is going to be in the Hampton Room at the Malott Commons starting at 12 noon. So we look forward to seeing you at these upcoming events. So Professor Siegel is going to introduce Richard Kahlenberg. Thank you.
Now, one of the many ways in which scholarship and policy work on schooling has been limited and compromised, in my view, has been the virtual divorce of work on K-12 education on the one hand and work on higher education on the other. Richard Kahlenberg is one of the very few folks who has instead put them together, and as a result has developed an overview of the ways social inequality in the United States shapes schooling, and in turn, schooling reproduces social inequality. Kahlenberg's work on public K-12 education has taught us that when we bring socioeconomic class integration into our public schools, we get measurable and significant gains in student achievement. He is as well the author of an insightful and importantly usable biography of Albert Shanker, the great union organizer of our public school teachers. An important intervention from Kahlenberg on this matter appeared, for instance, yesterday in the New York Times. So if you haven't read that, take a look at that forum with Richard Kahlenberg's contribution. Kahlenberg's other books include All Together Now, Creating Middle-Class Schools Through Public School Choice, The Remedy, Class, Race, and Affirmative Action, and finally, Broken Contract, a memoir of Harvard Law School. As that last title indicates, he's a graduate of Harvard Law School, as well as of the Undergraduate College of Harvard, and in a career path that models the career path of so many of our recent Pitzer alum who have earned Fulbright fellowships. Between college and law school, Richard Kahlenberg spent a year at the University of Nairobi School of Journalism, in his case on a Rotary scholarship. So he has that very interesting international experience between undergraduate and graduate. Today, Richard Kahlenberg pursues his innovative study of policies to promote greater social justice as a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. I am particularly pleased to have been able to bring him here in cooperation with the Scripps College Humanities Institute to join us because of the importance that the Munroe Center for Social Inquiry places in creating a richer dialogue between the liberal arts curriculum on the one hand and the discourse and practice of public policy making on the other. Richard Kahlenberg will be speaking with us this afternoon on a complex but pressing matter for every college in this consortium and every college and university in the United States. Should affirmative action be based on race or class? Please join me in welcoming Richard Kahlenberg.
Well, thank you very much, Dan, for that kind introduction. I appreciate it, and I really am relishing my time here on this beautiful campus. I am with the Century Foundation, which many of you may not know. We are a liberal think tank with headquarters in New York. I'm in the Washington office. It was founded in 1919 by Edward Filene, whose basement some of you may have visited. This is a West Coast audience, so that didn't work as well as... Anyway, so I'm going to talk this afternoon about affirmative action, and what I find interesting about the issue is that it is so difficult. I think there are very, very strong arguments on both sides of the debate, which is why I was driven to write a book on this issue back in 1996 and have continued to focus on it. So the question I want to pose is, should affirmative action be based on race or socioeconomic status? And as was pointed out to me earlier, some people may wish to answer that question by suggesting affirmative action should be based on neither, that we shouldn't have affirmative action at all. On the other hand, some may argue that we should have affirmative action on both socioeconomic status and race. So that's what I want to explore with you this afternoon. Okay, first observation I would make is that racial affirmative action, even for those of you who are strong supporters of that policy, is under strong attack from two sources. Ironically, the most democratic instrument in our system of government, the initiative and referendum process, and the least democratic element, the courts. So we have the U.S. Supreme Court as one potential check on affirmative action programs based on race, and the initiative and referenda process on the other. In terms of the law, the affirmative many of you may have studied the issue of the challenge to affirmative action at the University of Michigan in the Grutter versus Bollinger case in 2003. And many people thought that that had settled the issue of affirmative action. By a 5-4 vote, the U.S. Supreme Court suggested that it was permissible and constitutional for institutions to carefully use race in a nuanced fashion in order to bring about diversity on campuses. But that victory for affirmative action may have been short-lived. Since then, we have had a change up in the makeup of the Supreme Court, where Justice O'Connor, who was the key author of the Grutter decision, retired and was replaced by Justice Samuel Alito, who, as many of you know, is much more conservative and is unlikely to align with Justice O'Connor in his views of affirmative action. Secondly, we had in 2007 a decision involving K-12 school integration policies, in which by a 5-4 vote, the new conservative majority on the Supreme Court suggested that plans that used race on an individual level may be unconstitutional. And so the plans to integrate K-12 schooling in Seattle and in Louisville were struck down as unconstitutional. Now, one of the questions that came up in that debate was the question of merit. And Justice Breyer, one of the liberals on the court, suggested that one reason it was permissible to use race at the K-12 level when you're deciding which school students will go to is that there's no issue of merit or deservedness. So it's not as if someone worked hard and deserves to get into a particular non-selective K-12 elementary school. But that cuts against affirmative action at the higher education level, where the issue of merit is important. And the final thing I'd note here in terms of the legal context is that there is a case that many of you may not have heard of, Fisher versus Texas, which I suspect you'll hear a lot more about in the coming year or so. It's a challenge to the use of race at the University of Texas at Austin. And many people think that this case, which is now before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, will get to the U.S. Supreme Court, perhaps in time for the 2012 presidential election, and affirmative action will likely become a hot button issue once again. The key question in the Fisher case is whether there are alternatives to using race to get us to racial diversity. My sense in reading where the Supreme Court has been is that this is tailor-made for Justice Kennedy, who's this new swing vote on the Supreme Court, and that he may very well suggest that universities have to try to get diversity using other means than race and strike down the use of race. Okay, the other thing to note is the political context. Affirmative action policies may be popular on campuses, particularly liberal campuses, but among the broader general public, the use of race in deciding who gets ahead, either in employment or into a selective college, is very unpopular. There have been several votes on the question of affirmative action in California, Michigan, Washington, and Nebraska, and Colorado. And in 4 of those cases, a majority of voters suggested that they did not want race to be a factor in who gets into selective colleges. The one place where affirmative action survived was in Colorado, where the vote took several days to calculate because it was so close. In 2012, the question of affirmative action slated to be on the ballot in yet another state, Arizona. So right now, affirmative action is banned at public institutions in states which educate approximately 1/4 of the U.S. population. When you look at public opinion polls, consistently Americans oppose the use of race in college admissions by about 2 to 1. Particularly of concern to many people is that affirmative action based on race is blind to class. And so that question came up in one of the presidential debates in 2008. And President Obama or candidate Obama, Senator Obama, was asked, do you think that your daughters deserve preference in college admissions? Which presents the hard case, right? Do students who are coming from quite advantaged backgrounds, with parents who are highly educated and well off economically, are these types of students deserving of affirmative action? And President Obama suggested, and the answer was no, that they did not deserve affirmative action. Now that's a major concession because at our selective universities, 86% of African Americans are either middle class or upper middle class. Now I would hasten to add the white students at these selective institutions are even wealthier. But nevertheless, it is not economically disadvantaged or working class students of color who tend to benefit from affirmative action at selective institutions. And that seems to be one of the reasons that affirmative action based on race alone is unpopular. Okay, I would like to suggest an alternative to affirmative action based on race, which tries to acknowledge that there are strong arguments for race-based affirmative action, and at the same time honor the arguments against affirmative action, that we ought not judge people based on immutable characteristics like skin color. Now, the affirmative action alternative based on class would look at whether a student comes from an economically disadvantaged background, and we can get into some of the factors in a minute, but the notion is that if someone came from difficult circumstances, maybe they come from a single-parent family, had to work through high school, have parents who only went through high school for their education, live in a neighborhood where there are not a lot of role models of middle-class success, that if those students do pretty well despite the obstacles, then maybe there's something very special in those students, and that we ought to recognize that. Now, on the two issues that I've outlined, the law and the politics, class-based affirmative action offers significant alternatives, significant advantages. So in terms of the law, for a number of years, the U.S. Supreme Court has said that any decision based on race needs to have a very, very powerful justification in order for the Supreme Court to approve it. By contrast, using socioeconomic status or economic status does not require that extra legal justification. And so as I was discussing with one of the classes this afternoon, to give you one example, the Supreme Court would have no problem with our system of a graduated income tax in which affluent people pay a higher marginal rate than low-income individuals. But they would have a major constitutional problem with using race, where, let's say, African Americans were at one marginal rate, whites were at a different marginal rate, Latinos at yet another. So there would be a big constitutional problem with that, whereas there isn't based on income or economic status. Secondly, the polls suggest that class-based affirmative action, giving it a leg up to economically disadvantaged students, resonates with the American public. In 2003, around the time of the Grutter decision, the Los Angeles Times, Newsweek, and the EPIC MRA poll in Michigan looked at whether individuals supported affirmative action based on race or based on income. And importantly, they used the same language in the polling questions. They asked, would you favor giving a preference based on race or based on income? And as I mentioned earlier, by about 2 to 1, Americans opposed the use of race in deciding who would get into college. But the same exact set of voters or individuals favored using income by a 2 to 1 margin. So there's much stronger support for giving a preference to economically disadvantaged students of all races. The notion that today we want to give a leg up to economically disadvantaged students resonates with the social science research on what are the major obstacles that students face in doing well. So in 2010, the Century Foundation published a book called Rewarding Strivers. And in that book, we included a chapter by Anthony Carnevale and Jeff Stroll of Georgetown University. And they looked at what predicts a low SAT score and what predicts a high SAT score. And it turns out that the most socioeconomically disadvantaged student is expected to score 399 points lower on the SAT than the most socioeconomically advantaged student. So if your father was a doctor, if you live in a neighborhood where there are lots of highly educated people, if you are from a two-parent family, if you went to private school, if you had various advantages, you were expected to score almost 400 points higher on the SAT than someone whose father was a laborer, and where there were a number of other economic disadvantages. By contrast, the racial disadvantage per se was 56 points. So students who were African American, when you control for all other factors, were expected to score 56 points lower on the SAT than white students, which is the comparison group here. So race wasn't completely eliminated in the analysis. There was still a residual there. But it was clear from their research that being socioeconomically disadvantaged was the most important barrier to doing well on the SAT. And the notion here is that if someone scored fairly well on the SAT, even though they were expected to score 400 points lower, that they probably have something special to offer and have much more potential than their raw scores and academic record would suggest. Okay, so the advantages, the socioeconomic disadvantages are more significant than the racial disadvantages. And just as a note here, this is 400 points on it's the math and verbal sections of the SAT, not including the writing section. If we look, though, at what universities do in terms of affirmative action, it turns out that they pay very little attention to economic status. They give a very small leg up to economically disadvantaged students. And so this research looks at the socioeconomic makeup of the 146 most selective institutions. These are about the most selective 10% of colleges and universities. And this is an earlier study by Anthony Carnevale and his co-author Steve Rose. And they found that at these selective institutions, 74% of students come from the richest quarter of the population, and just 3% from the lowest socioeconomic quarter of the population. So another way to think about this is you're 25 times as likely to run into an economically advantaged or wealthy student than you are a poor or low-income student. Okay. Now, one of the big questions that comes up when we discuss the issue of switching the basis of affirmative action from race to socioeconomic status is what will that do for racial diversity? I think most people of goodwill agree that it is important to have a racially diverse, ethnically diverse student body in the 21st century. That's part of what makes for an excellent education, and that we want the leadership class that derives from these selective institutions to be racially and ethnically diverse. So it's very important to know whether economic or class-based affirmative action will produce racial diversity. So Carnevale and Rose in the 2004 study did a simulation using a large database to look at what would happen if we shifted to class-based affirmative action. And the way they ran the simulation was to suggest that all the students who are very, very well qualified, those who score above 1,300 on the math and verbal portions of the SAT, would continue to be part of a pool that would be admitted. So that would be what they call skinny merit. Some students would get in simply based on high grades and test scores. But then in addition, they calculate what would happen if you gave a preference to students who are socioeconomically disadvantaged and also included them in the pool. Everyone scoring above 1,000 on the math and verbal portion of the SAT. And the reason they chose 1,000 was that the research suggests that if you score above 1,000 on the SAT, you have a very good chance of graduating at the selective institutions. So it's giving a preference essentially for low-income and economically disadvantaged students. They define economic disadvantage as being in the bottom 40% by socioeconomic status, looking at parents' income, education, and occupation, or if you attended a high school which was socioeconomically disadvantaged. They assumed a lottery admissions once you put together this pool. Now, obviously, that's not the way a university would actually admit students, but it's a credible way of trying to figure out, in the aggregate, what would university ethnic and racial and economic diversity look like if we were to admit students based on merit along with a socioeconomic preference. Okay, and here's what they found. They looked first at the impact on socioeconomic diversity. Now, they're looking at students from the bottom 50% of the socioeconomic stratum. So we're talking about those who are in the two quartiles who are most economically disadvantaged, basically low income and working class students. Currently, they make up about 10% of the student population in the selective institutions. If you were to base admissions solely on grades and test scores, they would constitute about 12% of the student population. But if you gave them a preference in admissions, that would jump to 38%. So they wouldn't have proportional representation. That is, the bottom 50% by socioeconomic status would not have 50% of the representation. They'd have 38%. But that's a huge increase over what what low-income and working-class students have in terms of representation today. Okay, what about racial diversity? Well, in the year they were looking at this data, African American and Latino students constituted 28% of the relevant age population. Right now, these two groups combined represent about 12% of the students on selective campuses. Now, if you based admissions solely on grades and test scores, which I don't know anyone who advocates that, but if you were to, Carnevale and Rose estimate that the African American and Latino representation would constitute 4% on the selective campuses. Using the socioeconomic preference increases that representation from 4% to 10%. And the logic here is that African Americans and Latinos, because of, in some measure, because of discrimination, are disproportionately low income and working class, and would disproportionately benefit from socioeconomic affirmative action. Now, I don't think anyone should be happy with the fact that there would be a marginal decline in racial diversity at the selective campuses, right? It would go from 12% to 10%. But it's quite a bit different than going to down to 4%. And the question then becomes, well, what might be done to make sure that socioeconomic affirmative action is A, fair, and B, will produce more racial diversity than that 10%. And if we look at, that leads us to the question of, why is it that in the aggregate, low-income African Americans and Latinos are scoring somewhat lower on tests than low-income whites? Even when you control for economic status, there's still a little bit of a racial gap. Well, there are a number of things going on here. One is that there are differences in neighborhood poverty in the aggregate. So, and this has to do with racial discrimination and ethnic discrimination in the housing market. So, poor African Americans are more likely to live in concentrated poverty than poor whites. And that constitutes an extra obstacle that low-income African Americans face that low-income whites tend not to face. Because the research makes clear that growing up in a low-income neighborhood is an extra disadvantage. Even middle-class African Americans, those with incomes in excess of $60,000, live in neighborhoods with higher poverty rates than low-income whites. So that's one additional factor that Carnevale and Rose didn't count in their analysis of socioeconomic affirmative action. Another big question to look at is wealth, right? So there's income which you earn every year, and then wealth is what you accumulate over time, your assets minus your debts. And so we find that the wealth gap is much greater than the income gap between races. That is to say, the income gap between blacks and whites is such that African Americans earn about 60% of what whites earn. But on the other hand, African Americans own more like 10% or 12% in this particular study of what whites own. And when you think about it, it's not hard to understand why there'd be this enormous wealth gap, right? So there is a legacy of slavery and segregation in this country in which African Americans were not in a position to inherit wealth to the same extent that whites have been. So wealth incorporates our history of discrimination in a way that income does not. The other key factor here is housing discrimination. The biggest asset that most people have is their home. And because of discrimination in the housing market, houses in predominantly white neighborhoods appreciate at faster rates than houses in heavily African American neighborhoods. So these are extra disadvantages that African Americans on average face compared to whites, even when we control for income. Another factor is single parent households. We know that there's research that suggests the main reason it's a disadvantage to live in a single parent household is that you have lower income. But above and beyond that income effect is there's a negative effect of growing up in a family where there is simply one parent rather than two parents to help you out. And that's a problem that disproportionately affects African American students. So these are all additional factors that a fair class-based affirmative action program would consider because they are extra obstacles that students face. And it will also have what's called a positive racial dividend. That is to say, if we're concerned about racial and ethnic diversity, counting these additional factors ought to disproportionately benefit African American students and Latino students. So there have been a number of experiments with economic or class-based affirmative action, mostly in places where universities and colleges have been banned from using race. So the University of California looks at family income, whether you're the first generation to go to college, whether you live in a economically disadvantaged environment. The University of Washington, another state where affirmative action based on race was banned, looks at family income, parental education level, that sort of thing. In Florida, Jeb Bush, when he was governor, banned affirmative action based on executive order, and there came up with a number of ways to look at economic disadvantage. A couple other examples, the University of Texas looks at socioeconomic disadvantages defined in a number of ways. In addition, they also provide guaranteed admission if you're in the top 10% of your high school. And UCLA Law School probably had the most sophisticated use of socioeconomic affirmative action. So they can't use race after Prop 209 banned public institutions in California from using race. but they look at a number of different factors, including assets, or net worth, which I think is very important. A number of years ago, I asked the UCLA Law School to send me some data on the impact of the socioeconomic affirmative action program on racial and ethnic diversity, and they sent me this set of data. And if you can see, the SES stands for socioeconomic status. If you look at the chart here, 19 of 30 African American students were admitted under the socioeconomic plan. 26 of 51 Latino students were admitted, which was a much, much higher rate than through the regular admissions process, where only 13 of 331 African Americans were admitted, only 36 of 478 Chicano or Latino students were admitted. So another way to think about this is that African Americans and Latinos were 41% of the socioeconomic admits and just 6% of the non-socioeconomic admits. So there was a clear benefit, disproportionate benefit to African American and Latino students from the socioeconomic plan. Now, one big question is, if we were to admit students based on a socioeconomic preference, could they do the work? It wouldn't do any good to admit students who, even if they were very sympathetic in the sense they'd overcome lots of obstacles, if they were unprepared and were unlikely to succeed. So Carnevale and Rose looked at that question, and they found that today, under a system where universities they provide a variety of preferences based on race, based on legacy status, based on athletic ability, that there is a 86% graduation rate at these selective institutions. The bottom half of the socioeconomic population, as I mentioned before, only had a 10% representation. With socioeconomic preferences, that rises substantially, almost quadruples to 38%. And yet, through the model that Carnevale articulated, graduation rates wouldn't decline. In fact, they would marginally increase to 90%. So there are large numbers of low-income and working-class students who could do very well even at the most selective institutions in the country. Okay. Now, one big question, of course, is why not do both? Right? Why not provide a leg up to economically disadvantaged students and to racially and ethnically underrepresented groups? And when I was writing my book, The Remedy, that was the hardest issue for me. Should we do both, or should we substitute socioeconomic status for race in a system of preferences? But I ultimately came down on the side of replacing race with socioeconomic affirmative action for a couple of reasons. One is that the argument for using both race and socioeconomic status is essentially that we want to continue to benefit middle and upper middle class or fairly privileged students of color, because low income and working class students of color will benefit from the socioeconomic program. And to my mind, that kind of isolated the least sympathetic group, those who'd had lots of privileges in life. And so I found that argument much harder than a program which helps low-income and working-class students of color, as well as white students and Asian students. So that, I mean, the issue of whether Obama's kids should benefit, to me, highlights the weakest case for race-based affirmative action. But probably the much more important of the two arguments for substituting socioeconomic status for race is that universities have said for years that they do both. Right? We give a preference to underrepresented minorities, and we give a leg up to economically disadvantaged students. But all the evidence suggests that they don't. They only look at race and not socioeconomic status. And so I've concluded that the only way to get universities to care about economically disadvantaged students is to say you cannot use race in admissions. And so what universities then do is go to socioeconomic status, not because they care about admitting more low-income and working-class kids per se, but because they want to indirectly promote racial diversity. And I think to their credit, universities, when they were banned from using race, didn't give up. They didn't say, okay, we're just going to accept the fact that we're going to have a almost all white and Asian class. They worked hard to develop race-neutral alternatives, including socioeconomic affirmative action. But my reading of the evidence is that that's really the only way to get them to look at socioeconomic status. And there are three studies I'd point to here. One is a study by Thomas Espenshade, who's a Princeton sociologist. He looked at the value of various preferences provided in college admissions and concluded that an African-American applicant receives a preference, the equivalent of 310 SAT points. Again, this is on the kind of the old SAT of math and verbal. That being a working class applicant gave an extra 70 points in consideration, and being a poor applicant provided 130 points extra. This actually overstates the case that universities are considering socioeconomic status, because when you dig into Espenshade's data a little more vigorously, it turns out that if you're low income and African American, they provide the most of the benefit to the poor and working class applicants goes to those who are also underrepresented minorities, and very little to white students. Okay. Here's a second study by William Bowen, who used to be the president of Princeton University and the president of the Mellon Foundation, strong supporter of race-based affirmative action. He found that your chances of admission increase by almost 28 percentage points if you're an African American or Latino student. That is to say, if based on your academic record you had a 30% chance of getting in, the general student, if you were an underrepresented minority, that would jump to 58% chance of being admitted. Low-income students, those who are in the bottom quarter based on income, receive no preference. I mean, there's actually a negative, although it's not statistically significant. So basically, it didn't matter whether you were poor. You didn't get extra points. This was a study of 28 selective universities. And then finally, Carnevale and Rose, again, comparing what the student body would look like if only grades and test scores were looked at. Affirmative action based on race basically triples the representation of African Americans and Latinos. Based on grades and test scores, they would, the combined population would be 4% at the 146 selective institutions, and that jumps to 12% with race-based affirmative action. Still far below the representation in the general population, but it bumps up your the ethnic diversity substantially. Those in the bottom two socioeconomic quartiles actually do a little bit worse under current standards than they do than they would if we went to a system of grades and test scores. I conclude with a couple of thoughts here. The first is that many of you may be strong supporters of racial and ethnic affirmative action, and I respect that. But I think that even those of you who are very supportive of it have to start thinking about alternatives, because I think the chances are very, very good that when the U.S. Supreme Court next considers the affirmative action case, if if none of the justices die or retire, that you will have a 5-4 decision substantially cutting back on race-based affirmative action. The good news here is that we have a president who is aware of the economic inequalities in admissions and is willing to say that he supports race-neutral alternatives, economic affirmative action type programs, and will put the resources behind it. When I wrote about economic affirmative action and would speak about it during the Bush administration, they were very excited about this idea. Right? They were opposed to using race in admissions, and yet they wanted to be for something. And so I would speak at Department of Education conferences and the like. But when I pressed them on the question of whether they would support the resources necessary to make class-based affirmative action work, after all, if there's an influx of low-income and working-class students, you need a lot more financial aid to bring that about. There was silence on that question. But I think we're at an interesting moment where a conservative Supreme Court is likely to curtail affirmative action, but a more progressive president will come together and with that Supreme Court and support an alternative that, to my mind, is addressing the missing piece on the equity agenda, the issue of class and socioeconomic diversity that has received far too little attention until now. Okay, so why don't I stop there, and I'd be glad to answer questions that people might have on this issue.
I realize that that's the most common way of talking about it these days, but partly perhaps because it's the argument that won the Bollinger Supreme Court case. But correct me if I'm wrong, but my memory is that is a fairly recent imposition of an older framing which took the lack of diversity to be a symptom of ongoing structural and direct discrimination in the broader society. And I wonder if you think of that as the goal, if it changes any of your arguments or changes the kind of data that we would look at.
Right. No, that's an excellent point. There's been an evolution in the arguments in favor of affirmative action. For many years, the notion was we have a history of discrimination in this country that produced a significant legacy. It's no accident that African Americans in particular and Latinos are disproportionately disadvantaged in this society. It has to do with slavery and segregation and discrimination. Part of the reason that advocates moved away from that argument was that, well, as you point out, it didn't prevail legally, but it also raised a question of kind of intergenerational equity. That is to say, Alan Bakke, who first challenged affirmative action in the 70s, would say, I didn't discriminate against anyone. I'm not responsible. Maybe my ancestors did, but I shouldn't be held accountable. And over time, as we increase the distance between legalized segregation and slavery and contemporary America, the argument for compensation became weaker. And so I think that's part of why we've seen that shift. Now, I would argue, I always found the compensatory argument more compelling, right? The diversity argument just says we need voices at a university and therefore we should give preference to people who are underrepresented. So you could have groups that historically had been discriminated against, Jewish Americans, Asian Americans who were overrepresented and would kind of lose out under that argument. Because if you look at selective institutions, there is an underrepresentation of evangelicals and lots of groups that haven't necessarily suffered discrimination. And so I found the diversity argument almost amoral. I mean, I understand it at a pragmatic level, but I always found the compensatory argument more compelling, but it's kind of dissipated. Now, in terms of your question, does socioeconomic affirmative action address that history? I mean, I think it does if structured properly. That's why I think it's so important that if we use socioeconomic affirmative action, we look at factors like wealth and concentrations of poverty that incorporate indirectly discrimination, that look at, as I said, wealth is a reflection of slavery and segregation, much more than income is. And so I think that affirmative action based on socioeconomic status can indirectly address our history of discrimination in this country in a way that doesn't come back and then use race, which we were told should be forbidden, as kind of the, as some have called it, the disease as cure. So it's a way of indirectly acknowledging our history without actually resorting to race per se. Oh, that's a great question. I think it's an issue of priorities. I mean, I would argue that we are losing out economically as a society by not tapping into the talents of economically disadvantaged students. That there's a lot of wasted talent going on right now. Talent that could, boost our GDP considerably. I mean, the McKinsey folks put out a report not long ago talking about the economic consequences of the achievement gap. So, in other nations, there's far more support for making sure that students of all different backgrounds are able to go on to four-year colleges, and I think that should be a commitment. I mean, there are many hundreds of billions of dollars that we are not collecting because the Bush tax cuts were extended. I mean, there are a million different ways in which we could address this issue from a governmental perspective. In terms of institutions, this would require some hard choices. And you're right that it's possible that it will have a bite or a negative impact on academic quality. But I think you have to consider also the impact of the lack of economic diversity on the academic quality of an institution. I mean, think about the enhanced learning that could go on if low-income and working-class kids didn't represent, 1 in 10 students on campus. The New York Times had a front-page story a few years ago about Amherst College, which does admit students in part based on socioeconomic status. It's one of the exceptions. And talked about a classroom discussion of welfare policy, and a low-income African-American student, Tony Jack, kind of stopped the discussion cold when he said, well, has anyone here seen a food stamp? You know what it looks like? No one else had. And the article made clear that Tony Jack, as an African-American student, would not have been admitted to Amherst except for the fact that they were also considering socioeconomic status. I mean, that's one of the issues that gets lost here, is that low income and working class African Americans, as well as Latinos and whites, lose out under the current system that looks solely at race.
I just will add that in the small seminar earlier, you allowed that those of us who are faculty might have to take some bite to support to free up resources. So, all of us are implicated in terms of how seriously we might be behind that. Matthew?
There seems to me to be another supporting argument for race or class-based affirmative action, which is the highly documented correlation between academic performance and poverty in elementary and K through 12. So instead of healing greater societal wounds that exist because of slavery, that socioeconomic affirmative action can be seen as repairing simply the inherent flaws of the lower K through 12 academic system, which we are trying to work and improve at the moment, which wouldn't draw in any other larger issues of race or reparations or anything like that.
Yeah, I agree completely. The argument for socioeconomic affirmative action primarily is that ignoring the obstacles that students face is unmeritocratic. That if we want to have a real meritocracy, we have to figure out how far someone has gone, as opposed to simply where they ended up. So what obstacles a student had faced. I think an additional justification is that it will indirectly address our history of discrimination. But it can be, even if this country had no discrimination in its past, I would still argue for class-based affirmative action on its own merits as a way of addressing the fact that we have this incredible inequality in our K through 12 system, and that low-income and working-class kids who did fairly well have a lot to offer on their own.
How would you convince those groups that would be affected negatively by class-based affirmative action, the middle and upper middle class, Latinos, African Americans, whites, Asians? How would you address that political backlash? Because they're going to, the class-based affirmative action, less of people from those socioeconomic backgrounds will be accepted.
Right. I mean, there's no real way around that. I mean, it's a zero-sum game in admissions. So if you provide a preference to, legacies, then non-legacies are hurt. The way I would first of all, affluent, underrepresented minorities will still continue to do well under our system. It's not as if they won't go to college. They may not go to the particular college that they would have gone to under race-based affirmative action. But based on their own merits, this is a group that comparatively does well in terms of grades and test scores. But I guess I would appeal to a sense of fairness, that there are lots of lower income members of one's own racial or ethnic group that would benefit from this program. And I mean, it's an argument about fairness. It doesn't necessarily win the political day. So civil rights groups traditionally have a constituency of middle and upper middle class individuals. So the NAACP is not crazy about an idea like this. But I guess I would suggest that right now we're missing out on a lot of low-income and working-class African Americans who have a lot of potential and would win under this system.
I'd like to speculate on two other possible benefits, one fairly concrete and one larger and even more speculative, of switching to a class-based framework for affirmative action. One is that we might have an increase in the number of African American and Latino males who actually make it into the most elite schools, if we start to actually give credit on the basis of class as well. And then the other is, given recent voting patterns among working class white people, especially working class white men, to start to include class might erode some of that support for Republicans and increase the number of Democratic voters who would then vote for support for education and lead to some other kinds of long-term benefits for all classes, including middle-class white people.
Well, I'm very glad you raised that issue, because that is, in some ways, one of the initial reasons I got into this issue. In college, I wrote my thesis about Robert Kennedy and his ability to get, when he ran for president in 1968, he had African Americans and working class whites who voted, formed a political coalition for major changes in the society. And he's really the last Democrat who convincingly won white working class voters. And to me, it's always been a great source of frustration that a set of voters who, whose narrow self-interest at least would suggest they want to vote for the Democratic Party have been diverted by lots of other issues, including the issue of race. So, I mean, I think one way to interpret, this is an overgeneralization, but one way to interpret the political history of the past half century is that when working class whites vote their race, Republicans win. And when working class whites vote their class, Democrats win. So from that standpoint, race-based affirmative action is exactly what you wouldn't want if you're a Democrat. You want working class whites to identify by their class, not their race. And class-based affirmative action would underline that working class whites have something in common with working class blacks and Latinos and Asians, whereas the current race-based system underlines the divide and suggests, there's nothing, if you're talking to working class whites, there's nothing in this policy for you, and in fact, you're going to pay the penalty for a system of discrimination which they may not feel personally responsible for.
And then what about the gender issue?
Yeah, I haven't looked at that. I'm interested. What are your thoughts on that as to why?
Based on what I've read, we see a disproportionate number of African American and Latina women in select universities.
Right.
And the males aren't quite making the mark. If we added more for class, we would actually get an increase in the number of African American and Latino males getting in, and that would benefit entire communities.
Mm-hmm.
Go
Well,
to that
that's
slide.
I've
very
only seen
interesting.
a few articles about that.
Well, that's very interesting.
We'll go over to that slide and then scoot back in. Go ahead.
How would this proposal affect Native American students?
Well, Native Americans are another group that is disproportionately low income and working class, and so would disproportionately benefit from a socioeconomic affirmative action program. I think, I mean, I shouldn't have left any group out, but the largest representation in this country is, involves African Americans, Latinos, but I think the same logic applies for Native Americans.
In the back, and then we'll come down.
I have two questions. One is, Pell Grants are on the table in the House right now as a budget cutting measure, which would go against any kind of role in a way to afford college. But then most colleges are not need blind. There's already discrimination for rich students. If you have the same SAT scores and you're able to afford the college, you're going to get in private schools mostly. So how are you going to sell this to those colleges that are already discriminating on the basis of wealth?
Well, I think that concern echoes the earlier concern that you cannot do this without substantial resources. I think that we're making a mistake by not devoting those resources to investments in low-income and working-class students who have a lot to offer this country. So that is one concern. And then the point that Mary raises about the politics of all this is critical as well. If this is somewhat speculative, but it seems to me that if we do shift the basis to class, you can build some interesting coalitions that haven't been there to date in support of not only admissions policies that benefit low-income and working-class students, but also the important financial commitment that's necessary to make this entire enterprise work.
That in general, you gave a statistic saying that African Americans had a much smaller percentage of assets relative to whites. And then you mentioned as a side comment, you said, of course we know why that is. That's because of the legacy of slavery in our country. And I was wondering, it's in your talk, I was wondering if you would address current discrimination, because I think a lot of, I also Professor Bordel's point about that diversity now, but I thought another reason for having affirmative action based on race is that our society is racist. When you walk into a job interview, you are judged by the way you look and the color of your skin. And I was wondering if you had, what your opinions are on that and how changing it to class would ignore the actual real challenges that people face and the way they're, and Professor Bordel's diversity point, that people have different experiences, not just because of their economic assets, but also because of how they're experiencing the world. I was wondering what you had to say about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in addition to class-based affirmative action, I'm not arguing for repealing anti-discrimination laws. I think quite the opposite. We should put more money into enforcement of the laws that are on the books that make it illegal to discriminate based on race or national origin or gender. I mean, it's important to distinguish, though, between the two rationales, right? There's a rationale which suggested the legacy of discrimination requires a remedy. And then there's an argument that ongoing discrimination today requires a remedy. And the way people thought about this traditionally was, okay, we're going to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to address ongoing discrimination. And yet that doesn't solve the whole problem because there's still a legacy, and so that's why we need affirmative action. In its original conception, affirmative action was not meant as a remedy for ongoing contemporary discrimination. That's what the civil rights laws are for. So I would argue for much stronger enforcement, particularly in the housing area where you see a lot of discrimination going on. There are these efforts to use testers where someone goes to rent an apartment and are equally qualified, or sometimes the minority applicant is even more qualified, and yet they get turned away. I think there have to be substantial penalties for that. And likewise, discrimination in the employment sector. Class-based affirmative action also indirectly addresses ongoing discrimination because the way that discrimination is manifested is in, if you're discriminated against, don't get the best job you can, you're going to take a different job and you'll have lower income. And so your child will be more likely to be eligible for a socioeconomic affirmative action. So it's meant to incorporate that indirectly. But my primary argument would be that that's what civil rights laws are for. the argument for affirmative action traditionally has been it addresses the legacy of past discrimination in a way that prospective civil rights laws can't. But I would agree with you that we don't do enough right now to enforce those anti-discrimination laws, and we ought to do more.
We hit 5:30, so we're going to continue outside with reception. There'll be lots of opportunity out there to continue to ask our speaker questions. Let us thank him for joining us today.